I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at crucial updates from the battlefront, dig into the latest diplomatic developments in the EU, India and Turkey, and we discuss the invasion's environmental impact.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground, and our teams reporting across the world to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 25th of August, day 183, and today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and the Telegraph's Brussels Correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the warzone.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. I hope you can hear me all right. I'm currently being bounced around by Her Majesty's Royal Navy, somewhere in the Yogin. Can't really say where. I'm not allowed to say where. I'm on a story that you'll be able to read about on Saturday. But for now, all I can say is that if the sound quality is poor, that's because I'm in a glass-reinforced, plastic-hulled vessel that only came into service this year, I'm told. Brand new, and we're being flung about. So apologies for that. Like I say, I won't be able to tell you what I'm doing here, but that'll all be out on Saturday, and some audio for the interviews I've done with some of the folk here on Monday. But if I can try and keep my balance and my lunch, then I will get through the news of the last 24 hours. And what we've seen is another surprise visit by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's in Kiev today. He's with President Zelensky, photographed on a walkabout. He has urged Britons to endure the high energy bills, saying that Ukraine is paying in blood, so we should be able to pay in our finances. So he's there, probably almost certainly his last visit to Kiev as Prime Minister. The new Prime Minister going to be announced on, I think it's the 5th or 6th of September. Francis will be able to tell us exactly, but not long now till we get a new Prime Minister. So it's almost certainly Boris Johnson's last visit. Also, from on Independence Day yesterday, Ukraine's Independence Day, there was a strike in the town of Chaplina, which is about 90 miles west of Donetsk in the Donbass region. There were two strikes on that small town. The first strike destroyed a building and killed a child, and then the second strike shortly after that is said to have killed another 21 people when it hit a railway station and five rail coaches that were there. So 22 people killed in total there for seemingly no point whatsoever. Russia has said that they killed 200 Ukrainian fighters and knocked out a load of military equipment, but I think we could take that as a load of rubbish. I mean, there are images from the town you can go and find online. We've got it on our website. You can make your own mind up if you don't want to believe us. And the last point I'll make just before I get flung around here is that today's UK Defence Intelligence update has released imagery from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, imagery taken on the 21st of August, which shows Russian armoured vehicles and other military trucks 60 metres away from reactor number 5 at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There was some effort to try and conceal them under other sort of metal structures and pipes and all the rest of it, but it's clearly visible that those armoured vehicles are there. This gives the lie to Russia's claim that they're not using it as a military in any way, as a sort of military base, and they've been accused of holding the place hostage, holding the nuclear power plant hostage. Well, I think it's fairly strong evidence if you've got military equipment that you are putting within 60 metres of one of the reactors. I think it's fairly certain that you're not doing what you really should do. There's no word yet on the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Authority, I think that's the second A, inspectors who are trying to get in there just to make sure that the plant is safe. So no word there yet, but if you have a look at the UK Defence Intelligence update on their Twitter channel, you'll see the images from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I think I better take a break there before it all gets a bit messy.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. I think that's probably the first time on this podcast we've had somebody calling in live from a boat somewhere in the English Channel. So thanks, Dom, and do come on later when you're back on dry land. Francis, can I come to you quickly, just to expand maybe some of your thoughts on Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev?
Thanks, David. Yes, I'm on dry land here at Telegraph Towers. It's been to expand on what Dom was saying there. First of all, to answer the remark that he was asking when the UK Prime Minister will be announced. It's on September the 5th, so not too long to wait now, although for those of us here who've been following it very closely, it's felt much longer than the few weeks that it has been. But just, yes, I wanted to pick up on Boris Johnson's remarks because, as I say, he has been in Kiev yesterday, marking Independence Day for the Ukrainians. And I'll read what his remarks are, because I think he really understands the importance of the war, perhaps more than a lot of other European leaders at present. And so I'll quote them in full. "We know that if we're paying in our energy bills for the evils of Vladimir Putin, the people of Ukraine are paying them in their blood. That's why we know we must stay the course, because if Putin were to succeed, then no country on Russia's perimeter would be safe. And that would be a green light for every autocrat in the world that borders could be changed by force. To all our friends, I simply say this: we must keep going. We must show, as friends of Ukraine, that we have the same strategic endurance as the people of Ukraine." And as I say, this comes in, I think, quite stark contrast to certain other European leaders' remarks, which I know Joe will be able to talk about later on. Clearly, Boris Johnson's position on Ukraine has been much more consistent than his stance on almost every other policy of his, certainly in the domestic sphere. And I think actually it's to his credit. He's come under a lot of criticism here for all sorts of points that he's made in recent weeks. But on this, I think he has remained, as I say, consistent, and I think that history will be judged him very kindly as a consequence of that. Britain has been an earnest supporter of Ukraine since the very beginning, but not only that, I think he has seen the real battle that is at stake here, that this is about something that is much broader than simply Ukraine itself, but a almost philosophical and existential point for Europe and the world about what kind of world that we want to live in. Is it one where borders can be changed by force, one where might is seen as giving you a justification to make right? And if the answer is no to that, then that is why the battle in Ukraine is the first in what may be several battle lines that are being drawn on that very issue. Taiwan may well be another, and there are several others. So I think I just wanted to expand on Dom's summary, because I think it's very astute what he's saying on this point, and I think that there will be other European leaders who won't be saying this, and we should note that, as I'm sure we will in the coming days.
Thank you very much, Francis. Well, I think that links nicely to going to Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent. Joe, you've written a story about Matteo Salvini, who's called on the Italian politician, called on the EU to rethink its sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. This is amid fears of declining support for Kiev, which we've discussed many times on the podcast. Can you talk us through what you've been writing about?
Hello, folks. Yes, of course. It really does build on nicely from what Boris Johnson was saying in Kiev and what we reported on our front page story on Ukraine's Independence Day on Wednesday about kind of British fears that basically Britain is sending diplomats out into Europe and arguing that actually the cost of letting Putin win the war is greater than kind of the cost of our spiraling bills, which Boris Johnson put so nicely on his visit. But so one of the things that I've picked up speaking to kind of diplomats and officials in Brussels is they're now concerned that opposition politicians and some that are on the cusp of power, such as Matteo Salvini, have basically used this narrative and basically said, is it worth us having sanctions on Russia when kind of the effect is that it means that people in our country might be struggling to heat their homes, they might not be able to afford food, factories might have to be shut down because of kind of energy costs or just the lack of energy supplies. So Matteo Salvini, back to him, is an Italian politician. We could describe him as far right. He is famously pro-Kremlin. He was once pictured wearing a Vladimir Putin T-shirt in Red Square and is a kind of a public admirer of the Russian president. But he basically has called on the European Union to rethink its sanctions on Russia and ask the question, are these measures doing more harm to our economy than they're doing to the Russian economy? And so the diplomats I spoke to yesterday for this piece kind of put it quite clearly. They went, the message is simple. The cost of living crunch has given opposition politicians, whether they're far right, far left, or maybe actually kind of centrist liberal politicians, ample room to start attacking governments over their support for Ukraine, when, as I said, there are fears about people's kind of being able to put food on the table. And they are acutely aware that this narrative will continue to build up as we move into the winter and the cost of energy continues to kind of creep up. Cost of food continues to creep up, and they basically say it will become a kind of a key battlefield in domestic politics across Europe. And so I highlighted Salvini because Italy at the moment are contesting a election campaign after Mario Draghi basically kind of lost power and lost faith in his coalition government in Rome, and they are due to go to the polls on September 25th, and Matteo Salvini is part of a right-wing coalition, which includes Berlusconi, who is another friend of the Russian leader. And that has kind of prompted fears. Is Italy, say the European Union's third biggest economy, going to start arguing against the sanctions? And I think it's a narrative that Vladimir Putin will be sitting in the Kremlin, sitting in kind of his high red towers and being kind of enjoying this. He's constantly sought to blame Europe's economic woes on the crippling sanctions on Moscow, pushing messages like your sanctions are hurting you more than they're hurting us. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a message that Britain's been trying to spread kind of in the corridors of power in embassies around Europe. But actually, Boris Johnson came out and said it in kind of plain English, as we've said, that actually we're paying with higher energy bills, Ukrainians are paying with blood. And I think actually we've criticised Emmanuel Macron a fair bit for his handling of the conflict. But he also came out with a similar message and basically told French voters that, look, we're going to have to make sacrifices. The cost of freedom is more important than those sacrifices. We have to kind of end our era and our stages of abundance, he called it. Basically, yes, we've got to cut back. But if us cutting back means that we help Ukraine win the war, then that is a kind of a price worth paying.
Thanks, Joe. Just a quick question from me. Do you get a sense in Brussels about how Salvini's comments are going down? Do they think he'll be particularly influential? Do some think he's got a point, or do most rally more behind the British and French line?
I think as it stands, they are behind the British and French line, but it will have some resonance. We know that Hungary has previously spoken about the sanctions and how they have strangled the European economy of air and basically starved it of oxygen. And just the fact that Viktor Orban, Hungary's kind of loudmouth, strongman prime minister, who is also kind of, we can describe him as kind of Europe's closest leader to the Kremlin, has said that we should relax sanctions. We shouldn't go as far as we have done in the West because they are hurting us more. Is his kind of message. And we've seen him negotiating he sent his foreign minister on, which was quite amusingly, a Hungarian Air Force jet, which would be an EU Air Force jet, a NATO Air Force jet, to Moscow to basically say that we want to negotiate closer trade ties with Russia. We want to start buying more energy from you. And even the Bulgarians, which is, it's kind of, they paid high price for being so kind of anti-Kremlin at the start. And they were actually cut off from gas supplies from Russia in April. But they are going to start renegotiating with Gazprom to try and turn that supply on, which will likely mean they pay for their gas in rubles, which is a breach of kind of the EU sanctions regime. But is the European Commission going to do anything about it if the argument is, well, we need energy because we need to keep the lights on, we need to keep our factories on?
Just before I bring in Francis here, from your perspective, being in Brussels, do you think there are big splits coming in the EU further down the line, the closer we get into the cost of living crisis and this winter? Or do you think that maybe there will be a united European front going into the winter?
So I think the message about Europe relaxing or loosening the sanctions will get louder. But I don't think it's going to be from the governments that are in power in the EU. I think it will come, as I painted in this in this piece of writing in today's paper is it will probably come from the fringes, the kind of the loud noises will come from the far right, the far left, or maybe some more kind of mainstream opposition parties will also take the message. But I think one thing that does kind of unite Europe and much of the West is that they want an end to the war, and they think that Russia is in the wrong. But it's about how kind of you punish Russia, how you kind of help Ukraine bringing an end to the war is probably where they differ. And I don't think there is still a stable picture on that. So the French, the Germans even have different ideas of how the war should end. The Poles, the Baltic states, the hardline countries they are completely resolute with their backing of Ukraine. So I think there's going to be there will be splits on that. But I think what we have to look out for in the kind of the winter months is actually how quickly and how fast does the EU move with its next package of sanctions, its next kind of package of military aid? Because the EU itself has handed over 2 billion euros. I think it's 2.5 billion now to basically subsidise European countries sending weapons to Ukraine. So that's kind of a big step from them. So I think instead of a full-blown kind of, how would we say it, a full-blown kind of calling for the sanctions to be loosened, we're just going to see kind of Europe's response and Europe's assistance to Ukraine heavily slowed down.
Thanks, Joe. Francis, do you want to come in on that?
Sure, I just had a general question, Joe, which is you were talking about these European leaders who are more pro-Putin, or at least have been much more sceptical about the general EU's line on the war in Ukraine. Why is it that support for Russia doesn't seem to have hurt these politicians domestically? I think many of us expected that would be the case, that these leaders who perhaps had past associations with Putin or sort of Kremlin sympathies would be hurt. But actually that doesn't really seem to be happening. But what's your take on all that?
I think it all comes down to basically domestic politics. We use Hungary as an example. It's a very poor country, one of Europe's poorest, and basically, instead of picturing himself as what we see as pro-Kremlin, that he pictures himself as someone who's Viktor Orban, this is the Hungarian Prime Minister, is fighting for his voters, and that his constant message is, "Oh, look, Europe's constantly trying to make you poor. It's trying to hurt you. It's trying to affect the way you live and how you want to live." So yes, we would describe him as kind of pro-Kremlin, but he probably the case is he does not seem like that in Hungary. He is seen as someone who's fighting for the voters' interests. He's fighting for their pockets, for their views on kind of family values and stuff like that, which will mostly and often do clash with the way that Brussels thinks the world should work.
We'll just come on back on that. I mean, on these pro-Russian leaders and the point you were making about how they just don't seem to be being impacted domestically, and that's partly because they are maybe being interpreted differently in the domestic press, but also this issue that actually it's domestic issues that are always going to be in the forefront and of the minds of people. That is, of course, the real risk that we've talked about many times on this podcast, that as important as Ukraine is as a background issue, that when the energy crisis really begins to bite, that people in countries across Europe are going to look to their bills before they look abroad. They're going to look to their own domestic affairs before the issues happening more broadly around the world. And the huge risk of that, of course, is that they don't really see the connections between the two. And any connections they do see will be on blaming their domestic concerns with the war in Ukraine, and will want to see an end to that war as soon as possible. Now, of course, that's their prerogative, and you know, that's the benefit of democracy, is that people can immediately make their views clear at the ballot box. But the risk of that, of course, in the broader term, is that leaders who benefit from this are those who are on the fringes, who have traditionally been perhaps more pro-Kremlin or Putin sympathizers, and they will be the ones that will inevitably benefit in any time of economic crisis, just because they are the opposition parties. And so that is, again, one of these challenges. Is not just the current crop of leaders in Europe who are going to be making very difficult decisions and will have increasing pressure on them due to this energy crisis. But it's going to be the actual, as we have elections in the months and years ahead, and who knows how long this war could go on, that will be the real shift. And perhaps even that's part of Putin's broader strategy, is that because he knows that with the election cycles that will come, that may well see the back of some of these leaders that we've had up until now, that may well benefit Russia in the long run. Look at how precarious the situation is in Germany at the moment. The traffic light coalition, as it's known, could implode. Here in Britain, we've already seen the removal of Boris Johnson, obviously very pro Ukraine, as I was talking about earlier on. Now, it would appear that Liz Truss is very likely to win the leadership contest, and obviously she is equally as hawkish as Boris, if not more so. But that wasn't necessarily guaranteed when the leadership contest began. There were other contenders who were not as hawkish, it might be said. One might even say that Rishi Sunak, who's the only other remaining contender in the race, is less hawkish than Liz Truss, and it was looking very likely that he may well succeed Boris at the beginning of that leadership contest. So all of these factors, this is happening around Europe, all of these things are almost certainly going to play into a very different political picture, let's say in 6 months' time. And we don't yet know, of course, what the impact of that is going to be. Just on that, Joe, I mean, are there any major shifts that's going to occur, election cycles or anyone's tenures coming in within the top brass of the European Union itself?
So we have Italy coming up, which Italy is a major player in the EU. It's one of the biggest countries. It has the third biggest economy. So their voters go to the polls on the 25th of September, I think it is off the top of my head. The Greeks have an election potentially coming up soon in the next year or so, as their country kind of suffers with the cost of living crisis. I was speaking to a Greek colleague of ours in the European Commission yesterday, and they were saying that actually Greeks who love their summer holidays and they cherish their summer holidays, and it's one of the kind of the times of the year they really look forward to, they no longer can afford to do that because the prices have gone up that much. So suddenly, when, as we've been saying, when the cost of living kind of crunch hits you in your pocket and stops you from going on holiday, or does it even stop you from kind of buying a pint in the pub? Does your view on foreign policy then change drastically enough because your kind of domestic situation, which you'd normally take for granted, has changed? And I think as well, one of the interesting things that someone pointed out to me yesterday, another journalist, was like, Joe, you've never lived through a kind of a real period of inflation because you're quite young. And I was like, no, that's right. And actually, so how are young people going to respond to the war in Ukraine and Europe's support for kind of Ukraine when suddenly they can't afford to do the nice things that they kind of become accustomed to? And Europe as kind of diplomats, officials, bureaucrats, politicians who are pro-Ukraine have kind of been trying to reinforce this message that actually the cost of living crisis isn't down to sanctions on Russia. It's down to basically Putin trying to squeeze gas suppliers and stuff like that. They're not to blame. It's Putin's to blame, because that's one thing that politicians are going to have to do. They're going to have to, if they want to carry on supporting Ukraine, they're going to have to continually justify their position while people are suffering at home.
Let's zoom out from the EU and talk a little bit about some developments in international diplomacy, which might be slightly more encouraging for Ukrainian listeners. Just before that, a couple of things. Dom Nichols, I know, is getting into position potentially to come back on. He's been sending us pictures of aircraft carriers and naval ships as his boat docks, so that's very exciting. And we've also been sent just one comment from a listener who makes a very good point, one we cannot forget, that of course in Ukraine itself there's gas shortages and heating problems. Households have been warned to switch to alternative energy sources as well. So when we talk about the cost of living crisis and the energy crunch that's coming and has started really in Europe, let's not forget that of course that is happening in Ukraine itself as well. Francis, can I come to you? There's been two interesting developments which are worth commenting on, one to do with India and one to do with Turkey.
Sure, thanks, David. Yeah, well, we've talked on this podcast several times about a very worrying trend that we first saw in those UN abstentions several months ago when the war began, which was the sort of two blocks forming potentially of emerging economies and sort of the old style democracies, as it were, with the emerging economies tending to abstain on the issue of the war rather than condemning Russia outright. But there's been a welcome development in the last 24 hours in that India, for the first time yesterday voted against Russia during a procedural vote at the UN Security Council on the issue of Ukraine. This was following a video by President Zelensky, who actually addressed the meeting. And as I say, so far New Delhi has actually abstained of all votes at the Security Council in condemning Russia, much to the, I think it's fair to say, frustration of Western powers at the table, led of course by the United States. So I wanted to comment on that because it's not been really very widely picked up. But if it is indicative of a trend, it would be, I think, suggestive of a lot of work that's been being done behind the scenes diplomatically by Western powers to try and persuade countries like India, and no doubt there are others, that this vote or abstention, should I say, in the past on the issue of Russia is not a good idea. And perhaps, who knows what negotiations have been taking place, but I think that this might be suggestive of an encouraging shift. Just one other issue I wanted to comment on in relation to the broader international scene that's evolving is, as you say, David, Turkey. Now, Turkey, as again we've discussed a lot on the podcast, has this rather unique position of being in NATO and straddling Europe and the East, and as Turkey's traditional historical role has always been as a sort of broker between East and West. And of course, in some areas, this has been very beneficial, I would argue, for the West in relation to the war in Ukraine, because they've been able to remain part of NATO and have essentially been forced to choose a side. But in other areas, there have been some worrying trends. They were, for instance, are still going to be doing more trade with Russia than other European powers, and indeed, of course, they were the ones that brokered the grain deal, which one could say is a positive. But I think there were elements of the optics of that were quite concerning. President Erdogan shaking hands with Putin, for instance. But as I say, this interesting development is that Ankara has made a very, and indeed it was actually President Erdogan himself, supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and rejecting the illegal annexation of Crimea. Now, this isn't actually anything particularly new. Turkey has always condemned what occurred in Crimea in 2014 and the annexation. But nonetheless, I think the timing of this is very significant. So he was speaking a video message to the second Crimea Platform Summit, which is essentially where they were talking about the future of Crimea. Now, you would have expected, I think, that if Turkey was perhaps leaning more eastwards in the long term, perhaps thinking more in terms of peace negotiations, concessions, all of these sort of conversations, that you would have expected for them perhaps not make these remarks, which, as I say, from a Russian perspective, would be considered very, very incendiary indeed. And I think, again, that it may well be able to be interpreted as suggestive of a further hardening in Ankara of a pro-Ukrainian stance, which, as I say, is very much, I would say, favourable for the long-term prospects of Ukraine, given this timing at this moment, which is obviously a very precarious one for the war generally. I'll just read a few of the remarks President Erdogan said. So he said, ensuring the safety and well-being of our Crimean Tatar compatriots is among Turkey's priorities, obviously alluding to the fact that once Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire and sort of the broader Turkish sphere of influence. The return of Crimea to Ukraine, of which it is an inseparable part, is essentially a requirement of international law. So, as I say, strong remarks indeed, to put it mildly, and ones that I think in the broader context should be seen as a significant intervention.
Absolutely. Thank you, Francis, for talking us through that. Joe, can I come to you? You mentioned you're writing a piece about the latest update from the ISW. Can you tell us about that? What have they argued?
So the Institute for the Study of War, a US-based think tank, have been doing a kind of daily assessment of the conflict in Ukraine right back from February kind of time. And if you don't follow them on Twitter or have a look at their website, I would kind of recommend you do that if you're kind of a close watcher and interested in what's going on. So they do a very detailed kind of breakdown. But one thing they highlighted today, they have done some analysis about the land that Russia has lost and has won during the conflict. And say Russian units have lost now an area of land larger than Denmark since Moscow's deepest advance into Ukraine on March the 21st. And then in the last 39 days, Russian forces have only managed to seize a land the size of Andorra, which is basically tiny. So it kind of gives a real interesting perspective to how the kind of war is going on. And kind of Russia is like, it's grinding its slow progress through kind of the Donbass as Ukraine has actually managed to kind of dramatically chip away at previously occupied territories and basically liberate them. And the Institute of Study War basically looked at as well, and they gave quite a nice opinion of Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister's basic claim that Russian forces had deliberately slowed down their offensive operations to reduce the number of civilian casualties. And kind of in response to that, the ISW said, Shoigu's statement may also represent an attempt by the Russian MOD to set information conditions to explain and excuse the negligible gains Russian forces have made in Ukraine in the last 6 weeks. And it's basically, Shoigu's statement is likely an attempt to explain away their failings. So, like, it's a real kind of interesting kind of tidbit of information that we're kind of getting from their analysis of the land lost is, so they managed to lose 17,375 square miles since March the 21st. And then since Russia announced its kind of operational pause on offensives on July the 16th, they've only managed to capture roughly about 174 square miles of new territory. So kind of, does this show the impact that Western weapons are having on the conflict in Ukraine? It shows the resilience of the Ukrainians to actually be making far more progress than we probably give them credit for at times. It just basically shows how rubbish the Russians are doing at the moment.
Thank you, Joe. Dom, I think you're able to speak. You've been listening to all of this. I don't know how much you've caught. Would you like to come back or add anything to any of that?
Yeah, okay. I'm actually just in a car about to have to hand in my escorted visitor's pass, so I'm afraid I can't speak right now. I'll come back in 5, please.
Sure thing. No worries, Dom. Do just let us know when you can come back on that. Francis, can I come to you? There's been some interesting. It's quite speculative, but there's been some interesting news around the car bomb near Moscow that killed Daria Dugina. This happened on Saturday night. She was the daughter of a prominent nationalist intellectual, if you like. Francis, what's the latest here, and what can it tell us about what's happening in Russia?
Well, we talked immediately afterwards about how swift the SFB and general Russian authorities and Russian voices were to blame Ukraine for that car bomb that killed her near Moscow over the weekend. But there's been some interesting remarks made by intelligence experts who've said that although Kiev is capable of orchestrating such an attack, they actually think the prospect of it is very unlikely. And obviously from some arguments for why it would be unlikely is that it risks escalating the war in a way that Ukraine would not want. For instance, a general mobilization within Russia. But also it just talks about the logistical challenges of launching such an operation, the risks inherent in it if something went wrong, for instance, and basically questioning whether it would be worth it. So if that's true, and I say it's just speculative, then it would be, I think, a sign that it's more likely that what occurred was something that is internal to the Russian state itself, whether that be some sort of FSB targeting or maybe an internal issue that we don't yet know about. There was some speculation that it may be business orientated, an attempt to kill Alexander Dugin. And so I think it's just interesting that, as I say, that this is rumbling on, but the more analysis that is done, the less likely that the initial reaction that this was Ukraine that was responsible for this actually is to be truthful. And so in that sense, we should follow it very closely. There was also an interesting listener question that came in, which essentially tried to ask whether the assassination could be a false flag operation aimed at justifying, in quotation marks, Russia going after Ukraine's leadership itself. I mean, I think it's an interesting point to speculate about, although I think it's probably false for two reasons. The first being that I think it gives Alexander Dugin, or Dugin as he's sometimes pronounced, too much credit into his significance, as I talked about in the podcast before. This idea that he's in some way Putin's Rasputin or Putin's brain is a real over-egging of his significance. And I think the idea that he could be correlated to the Ukrainian leadership in terms of significance would be inaccurate. But also I think it's false in the pure sense that Russia doesn't need a justification to go after the Ukrainian leadership. It has already sought to do so since the very beginning of the war. There were numerous attempts on Zelensky's life, we know that. So they don't need any justification to do so. They could, I'd say, launch such an attack at any time and would deem themselves morally justified to do so, however egregious it would appear to Western and Ukrainian commentators.
I'm finally in a reasonably static position. I'd be able to add here. I'm sorry I couldn't really speak earlier on. I was in, shall we say, I was in the smallest room in the boat where there was a switch that said pump overboard or pump to tank to give you the idea of the splendour with which I was treated by the Royal Navy. No offence, it was a wonderful day. Thank you. All I'd add here, listening to the comments from Joe and Francis, fascinating as always, is I think Russia's in a real pickle at the moment in their narrative and in their comms. Look at the words from Sergei Shoigu saying that they're no longer taking offensive action because they suddenly care about civilian casualties. I mean, we know that's a lie. Look at how they've got themselves in a bit of a mess over the assassination of Daria Dugina, and is it Russian? Is it Ukrainian spies? Is it gangland? Is it whatever? I mean, they've not come up with a plausible explanation for that. And as I said the other day, regardless of what it was, something got through. So this Russia as this strong state, and Putin as this strong guy who's there to defend Russia and is all that stands between the Russian people and these hordes of sort of NATO-inspired crazies. I mean, that's chipping away at that. And then finally, we still haven't had a convincing explanation from Russia about the attacks in Crimea. So all of these episodes, and when they fail to get back on the front foot in terms of the comms and the narrative, or they come out with rubbish like Shoigu's said about the civilian casualties, they are just reeling. They do not have a comprehensive plan on the battlefield. They are increasingly isolated strategically or relative to the bulwark that is still in place. I take on board what Joe was saying earlier on about changes in Europe, and you're always going to get differences of opinion in democracies. But I just think it's really interesting to look at this incoherent or incomplete or absent narrative from Russia about their campaign. I mean, they launched this. They've been thinking about this for 8 years as a minimum, probably a lot longer, and yet it's taken them completely by surprise. I just think it's really interesting what's happening on the information front, and I'm going to have to take a pause there. But thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dom. I think we're starting to come to the end of our time today. So can I just have your final thoughts? And actually, Francis, I know you've got a note here about the environmental impact of the conflict. Would you like us to talk us through that?
Sure. Well, I have a listener to thank for this, Simon. I won't name his full name in case he doesn't want me to, but he sent me a very interesting study in the Journal of the Science of Total Environment, not the catchiest title as journals go, but nonetheless. And it just talks about the impact of the war on the environment generally. Now, I know many listeners will be thinking, why on earth does that matter? Why should we be thinking about the environment? There are far bigger priorities at this very moment. And I agree in the sense that the war shouldn't be framed in terms of sort of thinking about net zero or anything like that. But that's not what this piece is saying. This is actually talking about how the war has triggered a tsunami of impacts on the environment that will actually dramatically impact the world economy and food security particularly. So it goes into quite a lot of detail, but essentially it's saying that the war in and of itself may actually produce an environmental disaster. So although the war is ongoing, there's evidence of severe air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that are resulting from the intense fighting. Warfare activities are being conducted obviously in the vicinity of Zaporizhia, which has enormous risks on a radioactive level. Biodiversity is being drastically affected due to intense deforestation and habit destruction, which are the implications, of course, of war. Bombing, trench and tunnel excavations will likely negatively impact soil degradation and landscape morphology, and water availability and quality are likely to be affected due to infrastructure destruction and the transport of pollutants to water reserves, and it goes on and it goes on. But what this was saying is that all of this will hamper food production and the social cohesion and everything else within Ukraine and wider Europe, and will have a very big impact. And I just thought it was an example of, when you start talking about the environment, everything, of course, is connected, whether it be food supplies in one country, whether it be water health in one place. Of course, the dangers around Zaporizhia would have a huge impact across the whole of Europe if something were to go wrong there. And I just thought it was an interesting way of reframing what is going on. Of course, first and foremost, this is a human tragedy, but it is also a tragedy for the very soil of Ukraine itself. This will have something, and as the piece goes into talking about it in a lot of detail, this isn't something that's easily rectified. This will be years, if not decades, for the ecological damage that has been wrought in Ukraine by the war to be recovered, if indeed it can recover. And it just needs to be seen more broadly in that context, that this isn't something that relates to, nature doesn't recognise borders. It's something we will all feel the impact of. And in a sense, the food security is only one part of that. But that is the one that is the most acute right now. But there may well be others further down the road. So that's my final thought, is just a different way of framing this conflict, and one that I hadn't read before. So thank you very much, Simon, for sending it to me.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Francis, for that. I think we've lost Dom to Portsmouth. But thank you, Dom, very much for coming on and telling us a little bit about what you're doing and for some of his analysis. So, Joe, you're our guest today. Would you like to can we have your final thoughts? What should our listeners be thinking of in regards to the EU and European politics today and the next few months?
I was going to go on a slightly different track from the European argument. But no, I just want to kind of, and it's almost a look back and almost a praise of Boris Johnson. I think as he made his final visit to Kiev, obviously kind of his political detractors in the UK, and there are many, kind of sought to criticise him. But I just think it's kind of wrong to criticise a man who has done so much, and he was given Ukraine's highest honour for a foreign kind of citizen while he was on his visit, and he was given a plaque on the Alley of the Brave, as it's been kind of called in Kiev. So I just think that actually, if Boris Johnson's premiership goes down as kind of one of these controversial and kind of scandal-ridden premierships, actually we should look back at what he's done for kind of Ukraine and kind of praise him for that, if that's something we're going to do, because he's done a great deal in convincing Western leaders, and when him and the Americans were alone in kind of January, kind of trying to convince other leaders to start sending weapons and protective gear to Ukraine, he was kind of a lone voice with the Americans in that. And now he's one of many voices, but he has kind of stood out and really tried to use his kind of time in Downing Street to help the Ukrainians. And I think they'll be very thankful to him for that. And a lot of the Ukrainians that I speak to are very thankful for the British for that. So it's a friendship that will endure, not just between Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky, but I'm sure that Ukrainians for years to come will be thankful for kind of the British input and support that they've received from us.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.